She showed up to her own hearing with a tin box her mother had left her, and everyone in that room assumed it was empty. It wasn't. Inside were 7 years of small pieces of paper, each one written in the same careful hand, each one containing something Eleanor Voss had known to be true when the world around her insisted otherwise. The people who had taken everything from her, her position, her license, her husband's last peaceful years, they had built their version of events on the assumption that a woman who stayed quiet was a woman who had accepted defeat. They were wrong about that. They had been wrong about that from the very first morning. People in Harlan Falls had made up their minds about Eleanor Voss a long time ago. They had decided she was difficult, proud, the kind of woman who couldn't let things go. They said it kindly, the way small towns say hard things with lowered voices, and the specific gentleness of people who believe they are being charitable. But what they didn't know, what none of them had known for 7 years, was that a man named Grady Hollis had kept a single piece of paper in the back of a kitchen drawer since the autumn she lost everything. A paper that proved everything she had said was true, and he had driven 40 minutes in the rain to bring it to her. Before we go any further into Eleanor's story, I want to ask you something. If you've ever known something was true and had to carry that truth alone for longer than anyone should have to, this story is for you. Stay with us all the way to the end, because what happens to Eleanor is going to matter to you. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do it now. These stories take time to tell, right? And I don't want you to miss what comes next. The town of Harlan Falls sat in a fold of the Blue Ridge Mountains, the way something old and stubborn sits, not proudly, not beautifully, just there. Permanence without performance. The main road curved through it in a long, slow arc past the Dollar General and the post office and the diner that had changed owners twice in 10 years, but never changed the coffee. And at the far end of the curve, set back from the road by a gravel lot and 2 old maples that had outlasted every business on that block, was the Harlan Falls Community Clinic. It was not an impressive building. The sign needed repainting. The waiting room had 7 chairs, 2 of which matched. The examination room on the left had a crack in the ceiling plaster that Ellie had been meaning to report to the landlord for 3 years, and hadn't, because reporting things to the landlord meant a conversation, and conversations with the landlord meant listening to his opinions about the county health board. And she had enough of those already inside her own head. She arrived every morning at 6:15, not because she had to, because the hour before her first patient was the only hour in the day that belonged entirely to her. She would make coffee on the 2-burner unit in the back room, stand at the window that looked out over the gravel lot, and watch the mountain ridgeline go from dark to gray to the particular copper green of late October in Virginia. The leaves had been turning for 2 weeks. Another week and they'd be down. She had lived here long enough to know exactly what the ridge looked like at each stage of the year, the way you knew the face of someone you had spent a long time watching from a necessary distance. Her hands, when she wrapped them around the coffee mug, were the hands of a working nurse. Not delicate. The knuckles slightly enlarged from years of cold water hand washing, the fingertips calloused in the specific way that came from years of gloves, and the repeated small violences of clinical work. She was 58 years old, and she had stopped looking at her hands the way she had looked at them at 35, which was with the unconscious assumption that they would always do exactly what she needed them to do. Now she looked at them with the attention of someone who understood that competence was a form of gratitude and that gratitude required paying attention. She had gray in her hair, half of it maybe more, and she had not colored it since Bernard died, not for any particular reason she could have named, just because at some point in the year after his death, the idea of doing it had seemed like an energy she needed elsewhere. And then the year had passed, and then another, and now it was simply who she was. A woman with gray in her hair who arrived at a small clinic before sunrise and stood at a window with bad coffee and watched the mountain. Most people in Harlan Falls knew her story the way you knew the story of a local landmark. You knew it had happened, you knew the rough shape of it, and you had made peace with the version you'd been given. The version was this: 7 years ago, Eleanor Voss had been the head nurse at the county's larger community health center, a member of the regional health board, and an active voice in the management of a VA-affiliated Veterans Care Fund that served the county's considerable population of former service members. She had made accusations about how that fund was being managed. The accusations had been investigated. In the course of the investigation, irregularities had been found in patient records, irregularities that, according to the official finding, pointed to mismanagement on the part of the nursing staff rather than the administrative body. Ellie's nursing license had been suspended for 18 months. She had resigned her position on the board. She had come back to practice at a smaller, quieter level, and the county had moved forward and 7 years had accumulated like the fallen leaves under the old maples, quiet and slow and sufficient to cover what was underneath. That was the version. She had never contested it publicly, not because she accepted it, but because she had learned what happened to people who contested things publicly in Harlan Falls without enough to make it stick. She had learned it by watching it happen to herself. She kept a tin box on the shelf above her desk. It had belonged to her mother, pale green metal with a small dent in one corner from some ancient collision that had happened long before Ellie inherited it. Her mother had kept recipes in it, index cards written in a looping cursive that Ellie still recognized as her mother's voice. After her mother died, Ellie had taken the box without quite knowing why, and at some point she had started using it the way her mother had told her it could be used. Her mother had been a practical woman who distrusted abstraction. When Ellie was young and distressed about something she couldn't resolve, her mother had said, "Write down what you know to be true. The paper holds it when your hands can't." She had not understood that as a child. She understood it now. The box held small pieces of paper folded once. She had been adding to it for 7 years. Not a diary, not a record, just pieces of paper with single facts written on them. Facts she knew to be true regardless of what any official document said. Things she had seen, things she had counted, things she had verified with her own hands before anyone had thought to take the records away. She did not read them often. She had written them so that they would exist outside of her memory, so that they would hold themselves while she got on with the business of holding everything else. On the morning Grady Hollis came, the box was on its shelf and the coffee was on the burner, and the mountain was gray and dark when she heard gravel shift in the lot. She looked out the window. A man was sitting on the bottom step of the clinic's front entrance, not pacing, not knocking, just sitting. He was older, mid-60s at least, maybe more, with the particular stillness of someone who had learned that impatience was a luxury and had stopped indulging it. He wore a canvas work jacket that was doing its best against the rain and losing without complaint. His hands were folded between his knees. On the step beside him was a cardboard box, the kind that liquor stores put out by the case, sealed across the top with a strip of masking tape. She watched him for a moment, which was not suspicion so much as assessment. She had spent 30 years reading people in waiting rooms and on exam tables, reading the specific grammar of how bodies held their trouble, and what she read in the man on her step was something she recognized, patience that had been load-bearing for a very long time. She unlocked the front door and stepped out into the cold. He looked up without surprise, as if he had heard her through the door and had simply been waiting for her to finish deciding. His face was weathered in the way that faces were weathered by outdoor work, rather than worry the lines at the corners of his eyes deep and parallel, his jaw carrying several days of silver stubble. His eyes were the particular steady shade of gray that suggested a person who had seen things they did not enjoy remembering and had found a way to keep them at a manageable distance without pretending they hadn't happened. His voice when he spoke was the kind that carried without effort. "My name's Grady Hollis. I moved into the Callaway rental 3 weeks ago. I should have come sooner, but I had to be sure you were still the right person to bring this to." Ellie looked at the box beside him. "What's in it?" "Records," he said. "Mine, mostly, and a few things that shouldn't have stayed buried as long as they have." She held the door open. He picked up the box without being asked and carried it inside. They sat at the small table in the back room, the one she used for paperwork when the desk in the office was too covered to be useful, which was most days. The fluorescent overhead light hummed. Outside, the rain had thickened, and the sound of it on the clinic's flat roof section was a low, steady percussion that filled the spaces between words. He explained himself without preamble, which she appreciated. He was 64 years old, a Vietnam-era veteran, former auto mechanic, widowed in the spring. He had lived in Roanoke for 30 years and had moved to Harlan Falls because his late wife had always liked the idea of a mountain town, and he had not been able to think of a better reason to go anywhere than that. "I used the County Veterans Health Program," he said, "back in 2017 and 2018. Joint problems." He tapped his left knee. "Got treatment, got medications, got referrals, kept every piece of paper they gave me." He looked at her steadily. "I keep everything. My wife thought it was a compulsion. Maybe it was. But I've got the original forms from every appointment I had in those 2 years, with the dates, the referring doctor's signature, the billing codes." Ellie set her coffee mug down. In the fall of 2018, he continued, I was one of the patients whose records were included in the County Health Board's investigation. I found out afterward in a letter from the board that was very careful about what it said and very clear about what it implied, that my file had shown discrepancies, that there were dates in my record that didn't line up, that the implication was that services had been billed that weren't rendered. He paused. I knew that wasn't true. I'd been there. I remembered my appointments. But I also knew that fighting a county health board about records I no longer had access to was not a battle I was going to win. So I didn't try. He reached into the cardboard box and removed a manila folder, the kind that had seen years of handling without losing its function. Then I retired, and I had time to think about things I'd let go. He set the folder on the table between them. And I thought about you. Ellie opened the folder. The document on top was a billing receipt from the Harlan Falls County Veterans Health Program dated October 14th, 2017. Grady Hollis, patient name. Referring physician signature. Billing code. Dates of service. It was printed on the standard county form with the county seal in the upper left corner, and it was signed in ink by a doctor whose name she recognized instantly, and with a specific cold clarity, Dr. Alan Ferris, who had been the medical director of the program and who had been among those who testified at her hearing about the integrity of the records. But she recognized something else too. She recognized the form itself, not just the format, but the specific version of the format. Because there had been two versions of the county billing form in use in 2017 and 2018. The original version, which included a secondary authorization field in the lower right corner, and the revised version distributed in late 2018, which removed that field. The form in Grady's folder was the original version. The forms that had been presented at her hearing, the ones that had shown the billing discrepancies, had all been on the revised version, which meant they had all been generated after the revision, which meant someone had reprinted them. She put the paper down. Her hands were steady. She had learned over many years of clinical work to keep her hands steady, regardless of what was happening behind them. You understand what this is, she said. I understand what it means, Grady said. I'm not a lawyer and I won't pretend to be. But I know the difference between a form I signed in 2017 and a form that didn't exist in 2017. And I know that the version they showed in that hearing wasn't the version I saw. She turned the paper over, looking at the back. Nothing. She turned it face up again, held it at an angle to the overhead light, and looked at the paper grain. It was older paper. It had sat in a manila folder in a kitchen drawer for 7 years, which meant it had the particular slight warping that paper acquired from years of humidity and time. The paper in the hearing documents had been flat. She remembered that now with the specific clarity of a detail she had registered without understanding at the time. All the documents presented at her hearing had been flat. She set the paper down and looked at Grady Hollis. He looked back at her with the expression of a man who had driven 40 minutes in the rain and sat on wet concrete steps for the better part of an hour and was prepared to sit there considerably longer if necessary. I have 14 more of these, he said. Every appointment, every billing document, every referral form from that 2-year period, all originals, all dated, all on the form version that was current at the time of service. She stood up without quite deciding to walk to the window above the sink and looked out at the rain coming down on the gravel lot. The mountain ridgeline was invisible now behind the cloud. She pressed her palm flat against the windowsill, cool wood slightly soft with age, and held it there. She had known this. She had known it the way she had known everything she put in the tin box. Not as something she could prove, but as something that had happened in front of her own eyes and hands and would not stop being true, regardless of what the county record said. She had known that the documents presented at the hearing were not the documents she had worked with. She had known it the way you knew the face of someone you had treated not from a file, but from presence, from the specific texture of an actual encounter. For 7 years she had known it, and now a man with a kitchen drawer filing system and a compulsion that his late wife had gently tolerated had walked in from the rain with 14 pieces of paper that turned knowing into something you could hold. She went to the shelf, took down the tin box, sat back at the table. She did not open it. She set it in front of her, the small dent in the corner catching the light, and held it with both hands. For a moment the metal cool and familiar under her palms, and thought about what her mother had said. Write down what you know to be true. The paper holds it when your hands can't. Her hands were steady. For the first time in a long time she thought they might stay that way. She looked up at Grady. How long are you planning to stay in Harlan Falls? Something shifted in his face, not a smile exactly, more the rearrangement of a man who had expected this to be harder. I don't have anywhere else to be, he said. And the Callaway rental is month to month. She nodded once. Then I need to tell you about a woman named Ruth Alden. And after that I need to make a phone call I've been putting off for 2 years. He poured himself a second cup of coffee from the burner without being invited. The unconscious ease of a man who had learned that some rooms required permission and some rooms just required paying attention. He was right that this was the second kind. She had 3 patients before noon. She saw them with the full attention she always brought to the work, a blood pressure check on a man named Earl Combs who refused to discuss the salt shaker situation, a wound dressing change for a teenage girl who'd had the poor judgment to put her hand through a barn window the previous Saturday, and the further poor judgment to wait 4 days before telling her mother. A follow-up on a respiratory case that was resolving the way she had told it would resolve, which always produced in her a quiet, uncelebrated satisfaction. Between patients, she did not go back to the table where the manila folder sat. She did not need to. She had looked at it enough to know exactly what it contained, and looking again would not change anything. It would only increase the pressure she was already managing in the space between her ribs, and that pressure needed to be managed, not fed until she had something to do with it. Ruth Alden was in the back room. She had been with varying degrees of stability, a regular presence at the clinic for the past 2 years. A round of pneumonia in late winter had turned into a monitoring situation, which had turned into something closer to extended care as Ruth's heart made its slow, stubborn retreat from full capacity. She was 79 years old and had the specific personality of a woman who had outlived most of her contemporaries and had arrived at a philosophy of frankness that she dressed as humor, but meant completely. She was sitting up when Ellie came in after the morning patients had gone, which was a good sign. The window beside her bed faced the lot rather than the mountain, but Ruth had spent enough time in this room that she had made her own inventory of what was worth watching, and she could report on the comings and goings of the gravel lot with the specificity of someone who had decided to find the view useful rather than disappointing. The man on the steps this morning, Ruth said before Ellie had spoken. He was there a good while before you let him in. He came prepared to wait, Ellie said. The good ones usually do. Ruth watched her settle into the chair beside the bed. You have something on your face that you're not going to tell me about. I'm going to tell you about some of it. Some of it is better than the nothing you usually give me. She told Ruth about Grady and the billing forms. She kept it compact the way she kept everything compact when she needed to think clearly, not bare, but not dressed up either. Just the facts in the order they mattered. Ruth listened without interrupting, which was the discipline of a woman who understood that interrupting useful information was its own kind of waste. When Ellie finished, Ruth was quiet for a moment, looking at the rain on the window. Then she reached under the edge of her mattress. Not quickly, her hands were slow and produced a small envelope, the kind that came with greeting cards, its paper gone soft and slightly yellowed with time. She held it out. Ellie took it. Inside was a folded piece of notepaper. On it, in Ruth's careful, slow cursive, a name, a phone number, and a town. Staunton, Virginia, 1 hour north. Her name is Doris Fenwick, Ruth said. She was the bookkeeper for the Veterans Health Fund from 2015 until the end of 2018. She left in December of that year. She didn't resign exactly, and she wasn't exactly terminated. She was managed out, which is a different thing, and if you've ever watched it happen to someone, you'll know the difference. Ellie looked at the name on the paper. You knew her. She was a member of my church before she moved. We weren't close, but we were the kind of acquainted that meant she told me things she hadn't told other people because I was old and couldn't repeat them to anyone who mattered. Ruth's voice was dry in the way of someone who found accuracy more comfortable than false modesty. What she told me was that she had done things she was not proud of, and that she had been afraid, and that she had kept a record of the things she had done because she believed the only protection she had was to be the one holding the proof. The word moved through Ellie's chest with a precision that was not comfortable. "She made the changes," Ellie said. "It was not a question." "She made the changes," Ruth confirmed quietly. "Under instruction, under pressure, with the specific understanding that if she didn't, things would go worse for her than if she did. She was 53 years old, she had no savings, and her husband was sick." Ruth looked at her directly. "She wasn't a villain, Eleanor. She was a frightened woman. There is a difference." The rain continued on the window. In the gravel lot, a car turned in and parked Ellie's afternoon patients beginning to appear. The ordinary machinery of the day. Ellie folded the notepaper carefully along its existing crease, put it back in the envelope, and put the envelope in the pocket of her scrub top. "Has she talked to anyone?" Ellie asked. "In 7 years, has she said anything to anyone else?" Ruth shook her head once. "She called me twice. Once about a year after she left to say she was still keeping the record safe. Once 3 years ago to say the same thing. I told her I was still here. She said she was waiting for something to change before she spoke, and that she'd know the change when she saw it." Ellie sat for a moment longer. The envelope in her pocket was light, 2 ounces, maybe less. She was aware of it in the specific way she was always aware of the tin box on the shelf, as something that weighed more than its physical weight. She thought about what it meant that Ruth had been sitting with this information for 7 years and had said nothing. She thought about what it meant that Ruth had chosen this morning to take the envelope out from under the mattress. And she thought about the man in the gravel lot who had driven through rain to sit on her steps before sunrise, and how 2 things appearing in the same morning were either a coincidence or the particular momentum of a truth that had been held down long enough to start moving on its own. She stood up, looked at Ruth. "I'm going to call her." Ruth turned her head back toward the window. "I know you are," she said. "That's why I kept the number." She made the call at 4:30 after the last patient of the day. Grady had gone. He had stayed through the morning, drank more coffee than was probably advisable, read a 2-year-old magazine about deer hunting with the focused patience of a man who was comfortable in waiting rooms, and left just before noon with the quiet courtesy of someone who understood that his presence was a gift and not a claim. The clinic was quiet. The rain had eased to something finer and more tentative. Ellie sat at her desk with the envelope open in front of her and the tin box on the shelf above her eye line and dialed the number. It rang 4 times. She was building herself toward the possibility of voicemail, toward the particular discipline of leaving a message that said exactly what it needed to say, and nothing more when the line picked up. A woman's voice. Careful with the quality of someone who had learned to be careful about answering calls from numbers she didn't recognize. "This is Doris Fenwick speaking." Ellie said, "My name is Eleanor Voss. I'm calling from Harlan Falls. I think you may know why." The silence that followed lasted long enough that Ellie could hear the rain against her own window clearly, and the faint electronic hiss of a long-distance line, and the sound of a woman on the other end making a decision that had been a long time coming. Then Doris Fenwick's voice came back different from before. Still careful, but with something underneath the careful that was not quite relief and was not quite fear, and was something that sat between the two in the particular territory of a person who has held a door shut for a very long time and has just felt a knock from the right side. "Mrs. Voss," she said, "I have been waiting 7 years for someone from Harlan Falls to call me that number." A pause. "I was starting to think no one would." Ellie's hand on the phone was steady. She reached up with her other hand and touched the tin box on the shelf, not taking it down, just touching the cool metal, the small familiar dent in the corner, and felt something that she had not allowed herself to feel in a very long time. Not hope, exactly. Something older and quieter and more reliable than hope. The certainty that what she had known to be true had been waiting all this time for nothing more than the moment she decided to say it aloud. She held the phone closer. "Tell me everything," she said. "Start from the beginning." And outside the Blue Ridge evening came on slowly the way it always did in October. The copper light gone from the ridgeline, the first stars faint above the mountain, the town of Harlan Falls settling into its ordinary nighttime self, unremarkable and unaware. Somewhere in the gravel lot leaves fell without sound. The paper held. Doris Fenwick talked for an hour and 40 minutes. Ellie sat at her desk and did not interrupt, because interrupting was what you did when you were impatient, and she had learned that impatience was the most expensive thing you could bring to a conversation that needed to go where it needed to go. She took notes in the margins of an appointment sheet, the only paper close at hand in the small, precise handwriting she used when she needed to keep up with someone speaking faster than she expected. Doris had not been a villain. Ruth had said so, and Doris's own account confirmed it in a way that made the word feel even less adequate the longer Ellie listened. She had been a bookkeeper with 19 years of county employment, a husband with a degenerative spine condition, and a supervisor who had explained to her in the careful language of a man who prided himself on never saying anything explicit that the fund's accounting needed to reflect a certain structure going forward, and that her continued employment depended on her being the kind of professional who understood the difference between what a document said and what it needed to say. She had changed the dates on 43 billing records over a period of 8 months. She had generated replacement documents using the revised form version, the one that came out in late 2018, and substituted them for originals in the filing system. She had been told that the originals would be destroyed. They had not been destroyed. She had taken them. Not out of bravery. She said so plainly, and Ellie believed her. Out of the specific fear of a woman who understood that being the person who followed instructions was not protection. It was exposure. And that the only thing standing between her and someone else's narrative was proof that she could tell a different story. She had kept everything in a storage unit outside Staunton. A fireproof box inside a locked unit she paid for annually with a cashier's check. 43 original billing records with the dates and signatures intact. 8 months of internal email correspondence between herself and a man named Desmond Pruitt. And a handwritten log she had kept in a spiral notebook date instruction. Her response, any witnesses present, because she had read once in a magazine article she no longer remembered the name of that. The detail that saved people in legal situations was always the detail they had written down at the time, not the one they remembered afterward. Ellie looked at the tin box on the shelf while Doris talked. Her mother had known something about that. When the call ended, Ellie sat for a few minutes without moving. The appointment sheet was covered in the margins. She turned it over and covered the back. Then she folded it, put it in her coat pocket, and drove home through the dark. She did not sleep much. This was not new. But the quality of the wakefulness was different. Not the circular wearing wakefulness of 7 years of held anger, but something more like the alertness of a person standing at the beginning of a path they had been circling for a long time and had finally stepped onto. Uncomfortable in its own way, but directional. She drove to Staunton on a Saturday, too. She had told Grady the night before over the phone he had left her, his number written on the back of a receipt, the habit of a man who kept things in case they were needed. And he had said very little in response, which she was beginning to understand was his version of saying quite a lot. He asked if she wanted company for the drive. She said she needed to go alone, which was true. He said he understood what she believed. Doris Fenwick lived in a townhouse development on the eastern edge of the city, the kind of place that had been built to be practical and had succeeded at that and nothing more. She answered the door before Ellie had finished knocking, which meant she had been watching from the window, which meant she was frightened in the way people were frightened when they had agreed to something and then had 72 hours to think about what they had agreed to. She was 61, heavy-set with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, and the particular posture of someone who had spent years making herself smaller in rooms where that seemed like the safest geometry. She made tea that neither of them drank and sat across from Ellie at a kitchen table that had a stack of coupons on one end and a box of tissues on the other, and for the first 40 minutes she talked easily enough, going over what she had already told Ellie on the phone, the familiar ground of a story she had rehearsed inside herself many times. Then Ellie asked her to sign a statement. The room changed, not dramatically. Doris didn't stand up or raise her voice. She set her mug down and looked at the table, and her hands went still in her lap, and Ellie watched the particular internal arithmetic of a frightened person trying to calculate whether the cost of moving forward was larger or smaller than the cost of staying in place. "I'm not ready to sign anything," Doris said. "I told you things on the phone because I thought I don't know what I thought. That saying it was different from it being on paper." "It is different," Ellie said. "I'm not here to push you past what you can manage. But you need more than what I've said." "Yes." Doris looked up. "What happens if I sign something and he finds out before anyone can do anything about it?" It was a fair question. It was the question Ellie had not yet figured out how to answer honestly without making it worse. She said the only true thing she had I don't know exactly. What I know is that what you have in that storage unit is the piece that makes the rest of it hold together. Without it, I have one man's billing records, and my own word, and my word has already been ruled inadmissible once by the same people who would rule on it again. Doris was quiet. I'm not asking you today, Ellie said. I'm asking you to let me photograph the records. That's all. Nothing with your name on it, nothing that goes anywhere official yet. The silence stretched long enough that Ellie heard a dog bark somewhere in the building, and a door close on an upper floor, and the specific domestic sounds of other people's ordinary Saturdays pressing in from all directions. Then Doris stood up without a word, went to the hallway closet, and came back with a storage unit key on a plain ring. Ellie photographed 97 pages on her phone. Her hands stayed steady. She thanked Doris at the door, and Doris said very quietly as Ellie turned to leave, I've thought about her for 7 years, Mrs. Voss. What happened to her? A pause. I couldn't say that on the phone. Ellie looked at her. You just said it. Doris nodded once and closed the door, and Ellie stood on the small concrete step for a moment before walking back to her car. She drove home with 97 photographs and no signature, which was less than she had hoped for and more than she had come with. She had learned over the years to take stock of the actual instead of measuring it against the ideal, because the ideal was not what you had to work with. What you had to work with was what was in your hands. She called Warren Delk's office on Monday morning from the clinic between the 7:15 blood pressure check and the 8 o'clock follow-up. She had chosen him for the same reason she chose anything in a town this size. Process of elimination combined with the single reliable piece of information she had, which was that he had a reputation for thoroughness that was independent of who liked him. She did not know who liked him. She would find out. His assistant put her through without asking the reason, which meant either Delk was accessible by design or slow that morning. The voice that came on was younger than she expected, mid-30s, even-toned with the slight deliberateness of someone who had trained themselves out of speaking before thinking. She told him she needed legal guidance on a 7-year-old administrative finding. She said she had new documentation. She said the matter involved the county health board. The pause that followed was brief, professional. Mrs. Voss, Delk said, I'll be direct with you. My calendar has an opening Thursday at 2. I'd like you to come in. She took the appointment and hung up. Grady appeared at this clinic just before noon with a container of soup from the diner vegetable, not because he knew her preference, but because it was what was left by the time he got there, which was the kind of practical honesty she had come to expect from him. He set it on the back table without ceremony and sat in the chair across from her desk while she ate. He did not ask how Staunton had gone. He had heard enough in the phone call the night before to know the shape of it, and he understood that asking her to narrate an incomplete outcome was not useful. Instead, he told her about the veterans group that met at the old Baptist church on Fridays. He had been twice because the Callaway rental was quiet, in a way he was still adjusting to after 30 years of marriage, and the group was the kind of company that didn't require explanation. Otis Crane runs it, he said. He's 77 Army 2 tours, keeps the meetings short and the coffee strong, which is the right order of priorities. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. He asked me last week how I ended up in Harlan Falls. I told him the short version. He said he knew who you were. Everyone here knows who I am, Ellie said. He knew you were right, Grady said. That's different. She looked at him. He didn't say it that way, Grady said. He said he'd always thought the hearing hadn't added up and that he'd had a conversation once with a man who used the fund at the same time he did, a man who'd also gotten one of those letters about record discrepancies, and that man had said the same thing, that the dates in the letter didn't match the dates he remembered. Why didn't he say anything? Grady was quiet for a moment with the patience of someone who had asked himself the same question about his own silence. Because saying things in a place like this when the person on the other side has the kind of name Pruitt has costs more than most people have budgeted for. He set down his cup. That doesn't make it right. It just makes it true. Thursday came. She drove to Delk's office, which was on the second floor of a building above a hardware store with a waiting room that had 2 chairs and a window that looked out at the water tower. She had assembled her documentation the night before the photographs from Staunton, copies of Grady's 14 original billing records, her own handwritten timeline of the 2018 hearing, and 3 pages of notes from her call with Doris written out in full after she had gone back through the margins of the appointment sheet. Delk was younger than his voice had even suggested, 36 at most, with a lean, organized face, and the kind of desk that communicated that he made decisions about what deserved space and acted on them. He looked at her documentation for 11 minutes without speaking. She timed it without meaning, to the habit of someone who measured things. Then he looked up. And something had changed in his face. Not dramatically. A kind of recalibration, the expression of someone who had come into a meeting with one set of expectations and had needed to quietly update them. "Mrs. Voss," he said, "I need to tell you something before we go any further." His voice was measured in a way that had moved past professional into something more careful. "Desmond Pruitt is my uncle." The room was not large. It got smaller. She kept her hands flat on the arms of the chair. "I see. I want you to understand what that means and what it doesn't mean." He held her gaze steadily. "It means I grew up at his dinner table and I know exactly what kind of man he is. It means I went to law school in part because I needed to spend a decade in a different city before I could come back to this county and not feel like I was operating inside his shadow." He paused. "What it doesn't mean is that I am going to tell you to leave this office." Ellie said nothing. She read his face the way she read faces, not for what they were performing, but for what they were holding. "He's not a good man," Delk said quietly. "I've known that since I was 12 years old. I have never been able to do anything about it that was within my professional reach until possibly now." He looked at the documentation on his desk. "Tell me what you need, me." She drove home that evening with the particular suspension of a person who had stepped out over uncertain ground and not yet felt it hold or give. Warren Delk was Pruitt's nephew, and Warren Delk had looked at her evidence and said, "Tell me what you need." Both of those things were true simultaneously, and she was not yet sure which of them would weigh more. She told Grady the next morning. He listened, drank his coffee, and said, "The ones who know the most about a thing are usually the people who grew up closest to it. The question is whether they've spent their life becoming it or spending their life trying not to. Which do you think he is?" "I think you already know which one," Grady said, "or you wouldn't have driven home with his card in your pocket." She looked at him. He was right, which she found less surprising than she might have a month ago. She was learning that Grady Hollis had the particular intelligence of a person who had been paying close attention to the world for 64 years without writing any of it down, and that this made him accurate in ways that were not always comfortable. The Friday Veterans Group met in the fellowship hall of the old Baptist church, which smelled of wood oil and 40 years of potluck suppers, and had the specific warmth of a room that had absorbed a great deal of human gathering. Grady had mentioned it again in his indirect way, and she had heard the indirection clearly enough to understand it as an invitation without the pressure of one. She went at 7. She sat near the back. Otis Crane was smaller than she had imagined from the description, compact with close-cropped white hair and the economy of movement of a man who had been conserving energy for years without thinking about it consciously. He ran the meeting with the easy authority of someone who had earned the room's trust slowly and understood that it required maintenance. He introduced Ellie to the group with the specific neutrality of someone who knew her story and had chosen to present her as a person rather than a history. Nobody asked her to speak. She was glad. But afterward, as the hall emptied, 3 men and 1 woman came to find her, separately, in the quiet way of people who had been waiting for a context that felt right. They were all veterans. They had all used the county fund during the relevant years. 2 of them still had documents not as complete as Grady's, but dated, signed, real. One of them, a woman named Harriet Dunn, 68 Air Force, said she had written a letter to the county board in 2019 that had been acknowledged with a form response and never addressed. She had kept the copy of the letter in the form response. Ellie drove home with her notes and Harriet's phone number and the slowly accumulating weight of things she had not expected. She thought about what it meant that these people had been carrying these pieces for years in drawers and folders, and the specific internal storage of things you couldn't prove but couldn't release. She thought about what it meant that none of them had known the others were carrying them. She thought about what it would mean if all of those pieces were laid out together in one place where someone with the authority to see them could look. She went to her desk and opened the tin box. She wrote a new piece of paper. "The pieces exist. There are more of them than I knew." She folded it, put it in the box, and closed the lid. Lenora Bast was Delk's idea. He had gone looking for the audit trail, the external audit that had been commissioned and then abandoned in 2018, and found the name in the county's contracting records. He had passed it to Ellie without ceremony, the same way he passed her everything, a text message with a name and a city and the words she was asked to leave. Worth a call. Ellie found a LinkedIn profile, a company website, a professional email. She sent a message that said what it needed to say without saying more than it should. Eleanor Voss called back in 4 hours. She was 62, still doing independent auditing, and she had the brisk, precise quality of a person who had spent her career being underestimated and had made professional use of that. She remembered Harlan Falls with the specific recall of an experience that had been significant enough to be filed in the part of memory that didn't forget. She had arrived in October 2018, contracted for a standard compliance review of the Veterans Health Fund. In the first day and a half, she had found 3 anomalies in the billing structure that didn't resolve on examination. On the morning of the second day, she had received a call from the county administrator's office, not Pruitt, directly 1 level removed, informing her that the scope of the review had been revised and that her contract was being concluded effective immediately. "They paid me the full fee," she said, "which is how I knew it wasn't about money." "What did you do with your findings?" Ellie asked. "I wrote them in my personal working notes the way I do with everything, because I'm compulsive about documentation, and because I've learned that the thing you didn't write down is always the thing that matters later." A pause. "I kept the notes. I've had them for 7 years. I've thought about them at least twice a year for 7 years. Would you be willing to provide a written statement?" The silence this time was shorter than Doris's had been. "Yes," Lenora said. "Yes, I would. I should have done something with them years ago, and I didn't, and I've thought about that too." 2 weeks later, a signed statement arrived by email, 3 pages formatted with the careful precision of someone who understood that the document would be read by people who looked for inconsistencies. Ellie printed it, put it in the file she was building with Warren Delk, and walked to the shelf. She added a piece of paper to the tin box Lenora Bast. Signed, October 28th. October. She stood at the shelf for a moment with her hand on the box lid. It was heavier than it had been a month ago. Not from the papers, they weighed almost nothing. From what they held. On a Thursday in November, Desmond Pruitt came to the clinic. She knew it was him before she turned around from the particular quality of his footstep in the front room, the step of a man who had walked into rooms as the most consequential person in them for so long that his body had simply absorbed that assumption. She finished writing the note she was making, set down her pen, and turned. He was 68, large without being heavy, with a face that had been handsome in the way of a man who had known it for 40 years and had made use of the knowledge. He had the ease of someone who had never been in a room where someone else made the rules, or if he had not been in one recently enough to remember what it felt like. He looked around the clinic with the measured interest of a man appraising something he had already categorized and found manageable. "Eleanor," he said. "Not Mrs. Voss." "Dr. Pruitt," she said. He wasn't a doctor. She had chosen the title precisely. He sat down in the chair across from her desk without being invited, with the comfort of someone who sat wherever they chose, which she had expected. He folded his hands on his knee. He looked at her with an expression that was professionally kind, in the specific way of someone who had learned to wear kindness as a navigational tool. "I hear you've been talking to people," he said. "Old names, old cases." He paused. "I understand the impulse. 7 years is a long time to sit with something that feels unfinished." She did not speak. She had decided before this conversation happened, and she had known it would happen, that she would give him as little as possible to work with. "I want you to know," he continued, "that I have no ill will toward you. Whatever happened in 2018 was complicated. These things are always complicated in retrospect. There are things I would have handled differently." He tilted his head slightly. "But I worry about you, Eleanor. You've built something here, small as it is. You've built it carefully, and I would hate to see you spend the energy you have left on something that isn't going to give you what you're looking for." She looked at him for a long moment. She looked at the quality of his eyes, which were blue and pleasant and entirely untroubled, and she thought about what it meant to be a man who had done what he had done and remained entirely untroubled. "I appreciate your concern," she said. Something moved through his expression, a small recalibration, almost invisible. He had expected more, or less. He had expected something that he could use, and she had given him a sentence with nothing in it. He stood, adjusted his jacket, moved toward the door with the unhurried pace of a man who had never been in a place he couldn't leave on his own terms. At the door he stopped, turned back as if the thought had arrived naturally. "Bernard was a good man," he said. "He wouldn't have wanted this for you." The room was very still. She did not answer. She held his gaze without expression and waited for him to leave, which he did after a moment that lasted precisely as long as he needed it to, and not a second longer. When the sound of his car had left the gravel lot, she got up, went to the shelf, took down the tin box, and sat at her desk with it in both hands. She did not open it. She just held it. The metal cool, familiar, the dent in the corner catching the afternoon light. He had said Bernard's name, deliberately and carefully, in the voice of a man who understood exactly what he was touching and had chosen to touch it. She sat with that until the heat of it passed through her and moved into something colder and cleaner and more useful. Then she put the box back on the shelf, picked up her phone, and called her daughter. She had not called Cecily in 3 weeks. The calls between them had a careful structure, regular enough to maintain connection, not frequent enough to require anything more. It had been this way for years, and Ellie had told herself for years that it was what Cecily needed: the space, the distance, the respectful non-pressure. She had told herself this with the conviction of a woman who was very good at finding logical frames for things that were actually grief. The phone rang twice. "Mom." Cecily's voice carried the particular alertness of a daughter who had learned to read the timbre of her mother's calls. Ellie said, "I heard something today that made me want to hear your voice." A pause. The kind of pause that had 7 years of careful navigation in it. Then Cecily said, "I heard from someone in Harlan Falls last week. They said you were looking into things again." "I am." "Are you—" Cecily stopped, started again. "How is it going?" "Slowly," Ellie said. Then not slowly. Another pause, shorter. When Cecily spoke again, her voice had shifted, the careful surface of it giving way to something underneath that had been waiting for a different kind of opening. "I left because I couldn't watch them do it to you and have you just absorb it, like it was something you deserved." Her voice was controlled, but only just. "I thought if I stayed, I'd do something that would make it worse for you. And I thought if I left, maybe you'd stop being so quiet about it." A breath. "But you stayed quiet anyway, and I was just gone, and I've spent 7 years not knowing if I made the right call." "You didn't make a wrong one," Ellie said. "Mom, I mean it. You were 24. You couldn't have done anything that I wasn't in a position to use. And I wasn't in a position yet." She looked at the tin box on the shelf. "I am now." The silence that followed was different from all the silences that had come before it. Not the silence of a conversation being managed, but the silence of two people on either end of a long distance, settling into something that felt tentatively and carefully like ground. "Tell me what you need," Cecily said finally. And Ellie felt something in her chest loosen that she had not known was still tightened. "Not yet," she said. "But I'll tell you when." She was not expecting what came 3 days later. Warren Delk called in the morning before her first patient. His voice had the quality she had learned to read as information arriving faster than anticipated. "I've been going through the fund's financial history," he said. "The annual reports, the grant applications, the federal documentation. Because the fund received via money federal dollars through the Veterans Administration program, I wanted to understand the full compliance chain." A pause. "Ellie, the billing fraud isn't just a county matter." She stopped what she was doing. "The fund received federal money," he said, "which means the billing records that were falsified were also federal records, which means what Pruitt authorized isn't just a local administrative violation." His voice was careful, even like a person laying down something fragile. "It's federal healthcare fraud, potentially wire fraud given the grant application cycle. This is not something the county board can adjudicate." She sat with that for a moment. "Which means," she said slowly, "that Pruitt can't manage this the way he managed the last one." "He doesn't have the reach," Delk said. "Not for federal investigators, not for the VA's Office of Inspector General." The particular stillness that moved through her then was not triumph. It was something quieter and more structural. The feeling of a door that had been sealed for 7 years swinging open, because the wall it was set into had turned out to be load-bearing on the wrong side. She thanked him and set down the phone. Looked at the tin box. looked at the mountain through the window, which was bare now. The leaves gone, the ridgeline clean against the November gray. She thought about Desmond Pruitt sitting in that chair and saying Bernard's name. She thought about Doris Fenwick in a storage unit outside Staunton, paying annually with a cashier's check for a fireproof box full of the truth. She thought about Harriet Dunn and her form letter response and the copy she had kept for 6 years in a drawer. She reached for the tin box, opened it, took out a blank piece of paper and wrote 3 words. The wall moved. She was folding the paper when her phone rang again. A number she didn't recognize, Virginia area code. She answered. The voice on the other end was not Delk and not Grady and not anyone she knew. It was a woman's voice, measured and careful in the way of someone who had chosen every word before dialing. Mrs. Voss, my name is Cecily. A pause. Not your daughter. My name is Cecily Arnaud. I'm a paralegal at a firm in Richmond that has been retained by Desmond Pruitt as of this morning. Another pause, shorter. I'm not calling on his behalf. I'm calling because I was his paralegal 3 years ago before I changed firms, and I kept something I should have turned over then, and I didn't, and I've been trying to decide what to do with it ever since. Ellie's hand was very still on the phone. He retained new counsel this morning, the woman continued, which means he's preparing to fight something. And when a man like that starts preparing to fight, the people who know things about him have a narrowing window. What did you keep? Ellie said. The answer was a memo. Internal. 3 years old. Written in Pruitt's hand and drafted with the careful indirectness that she had already observed in person, the language of a man who had spent decades saying things without technically saying them. But this memo had a name in it that hadn't appeared anywhere else. The name was Doris Fenwick. And the memo discussed in the considered language of legal preparation what options existed for managing a former employee who had retained documentation from her period of county service, and what outcomes were most desirable, and what resources were available to pursue them. He had known. For at least 3 years he had known that Doris had kept the records, and he had been preparing. Ellie stood at the window of the clinic in the November gray and understood with a clarity that had nothing comfortable in it that she was not the only one who had been waiting. That on the other side of 7 years of quiet, a man who had everything to lose had also been watching, had also been building, had also known long before this autumn that the question was not whether the door would open. The question was who would be standing when it did. The paper holds it when your hands can't. She looked at the tin box. Her hands were steady. But she understood now that steady was no longer enough. She called Warren Delk before she called anyone else. Not because he was the most important call, but because he was the most useful one. And she had learned a long time ago that the difference between panic and action was the first decision you made after the ground moved. Panic reached for comfort. Action reached for the next right thing. Delk picked up on the second ring. She told him about Cecily Arnaud in the same compact way she told him everything, name, firm, what she had kept, what the memo said, why she was calling now. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment with the particular quality of silence that meant he was moving pieces rather than absorbing them. He's known about Doris for 3 years, Delk said. Yes. And he retained new counsel this morning. Yes. Another pause. Which means whatever he's been preparing, he's decided to start using it. His voice shifted into a register she had not heard from him before, not alarmed, but accelerated the cadence of a person who had just understood that the timeline had changed. I need to file before he does. If he gets a motion in first, any kind of preemptive legal action against Doris or against you, it creates a procedural obstacle that will cost us weeks we don't have. What do you need from me? Cecily Arnaud's contact information and the memo if she'll provide it. Today, if possible. I'll call her back in 10 minutes. She did. Cecily Arnaud answered on the first ring, which meant she had been holding the phone. She had the memo in digital form, photographed, not a clean scan, but legible. She emailed it to Ellie while they were still talking. Ellie forwarded it to Delk without opening her own email client because opening it would mean reading it again, and reading it again would mean feeling again what she had felt the first time, and she needed to stay on the right side of that line until there was time to cross it properly. She forwarded the contact information. She texted Grady. She called Doris. Doris picked up, and Ellie said without preamble, "He knows you kept the records. He's known for at least 3 years. He retained a lawyer this morning, and we are filing before he can move. I need you to be reachable today, and I need you to know that what you're holding is about to matter more than it ever has." The silence on Doris's end was shorter than any silence she had given before. "Tell me what to do," Doris said. That was the thing about fear Ellie had observed over 30 years of clinical work. It did not always make people smaller. Sometimes when it finally had a direction to move in, it made them exactly the size they needed to be. Delk filed a formal complaint with the Virginia Attorney General's office and simultaneously submitted a referral package to the VA's Office of Inspector General before 4 o'clock that afternoon. The package contained Grady's 14 original billing records, the photographed documentation from Doris's storage unit, Lenora Bast's signed statement, Harriet Dunn's letter, and the form response, the internal memo obtained by Cecily Arnaud, and a 12-page legal summary that Delk had been quietly building for 3 weeks in the time between their meetings, in the way that thorough people built things steadily and without announcing it. He called Ellie when it was done. He said it was filed. He said it was out of their hands now in the specific way that meant it was in the right hands. She sat in the clinic after the call in the chair behind her desk in the late afternoon gray of a November Tuesday and let herself be still for a full 5 minutes. Not thinking, not planning, just sitting with the fact that the thing was moving now under its own authority with its own weight in a direction that did not require her to push it any further. She thought about Doris Fenwick paying her annual cashier's check. 7 years of keeping a storage unit for a fireproof box for a truth that had nowhere yet to go. She thought about Harriet Dunn's form letter filed in a drawer with the care of someone who had not given up on the possibility that it might someday be useful. She thought about Lenora Bast, writing in her personal working notes, with the compulsive thoroughness of someone who understood that the detail you recorded at the time was always the one that mattered. She thought about Grady Hollis keeping every piece of paper in a kitchen drawer because his wife had called it a compulsion, and because he had never found a good argument against it. She thought about her mother who had kept recipes in a tin box and understood without theorizing about it that the things you wrote down survived the moments when your hands couldn't hold them. She reached up and took the tin box from the shelf. She set it on the desk and looked at it. The green metal, the small dent in the corner, the ordinary, unremarkable object that had sat on a shelf in this room for 7 years while she moved around it and occasionally touched it and almost never opened it in the middle of a workday. Because opening it in the middle of a workday meant standing inside everything it held, and there was always something else that needed doing. She opened it now. The papers were folded small and layered in the order she had added them, the oldest at the bottom and the newest on top. She took them out one at a time and laid them on the desk in a row, unfolding each one, smoothing it flat with the heel of her hand. The oldest ones were from the first year. The dates on the documents they showed were not the dates on the documents I signed. Written in her handwriting, which was smaller, then more compressed, the handwriting of someone still in shock and trying to be precise in the middle of it. Dr. Ferris's testimony about the revision cycle was not accurate. The original form was still in use in October 2017. I handled those forms myself. And then further down the stack, the ones from the years after Bernard said last night that he believed me. He didn't say it as comfort. He said it as a fact. A pause between papers, the white space of a year. Bernard is gone. I am keeping this box because he would have told me to. She had not read these in order before. She had added to the box and occasionally taken out the most recent papers and looked at them, but she had not sat down and read the whole sequence because the whole sequence was the whole story. And the whole story was a thing she had been rationing herself against. She read it now. It took 20 minutes. Outside the window, the light was going the way November light went, not dramatically, not all at once, just a slow and even withdrawal, the gray becoming darker gray, and the shapes of the maples against the lot becoming outlines and then silhouettes and then suggestions. When she finished, she held all the papers in her hands, the full weight of them, which was still almost nothing by any physical measure, and which was the heaviest thing in the room. She thought about Bernard. She thought about the specific way he had believed her, not with the loud championship of someone performing loyalty, but with the quiet, structural certainty of a man who had made his assessment once and saw no reason to revisit it. He had believed her the way he had done everything without announcement. It had been the most sustaining thing about him. It had also been the thing she had least known how to carry after he was gone, because when the person who held your truth without being asked is no longer there, You have to learn to hold it yourself, and that was a different weight than it looked like from the outside. She refolded the papers, put them back in the box, all except one. The one she had written on the first night Grady came. The pieces exist. There are more of them than I knew. She kept that one out, folded it along its crease, and set it on the desk beside the box. She would give it to Cecily. Not as explanation, just as evidence that she had known even then that she was not alone. The weeks that followed had their own pace, which was not the pace she would have chosen, and was the only pace available. Federal investigations moved according to their own chronology, and Warren Delk had prepared her for this, had said it plainly in their first conversation after the filing that the referral had been accepted, and the review was active, and that active did not mean immediate, that these things moved with the thoroughness that made them hold, and that holding was what mattered. She went to work. She saw her patients. She covered a shift for Nate Harker down at the urgent care in the next town over when he had a family matter because he had asked and she could, and because the work itself had always been the part she trusted most. The uncomplicated transaction of one person using what they knew to help another person without committees or findings or 7-year official records. Grady came by most mornings. Not every morning he had his own life assembling itself in the Callaway rental, the slow business of a person learning to live in a new place without the person who had always been in the place with them. He brought coffee sometimes. Sometimes he sat in the back room and read. Once he appeared with a piece of her roof gutter that had come loose and a ladder from somewhere, and he reattached it without mentioning it until she came outside and found him on the ladder, at which point he said only, "Wind's coming." She did not find this annoying. She found it the kind of practical, unpretentious consideration that she had almost forgotten existed, and she was careful not to make too much of it, because making too much of things was how you frightened them away. Cecily drove up from Richmond on the second Saturday of December. Ellie had not asked her to come. Cecily had called on a Wednesday and said she had a long weekend and was thinking of making the drive, and Ellie had said the guest room had clean sheets, which was the closest thing to "please come" that she had said to her daughter in 7 years, and they both knew it. She arrived in the early afternoon in a light snow that had begun around noon, the first real snow of the season, thin and tentative, more suggestion than accumulation. The mountains were white at the top and gray-green below the snow line, and the old maples in the clinic lot were bare and still. And the whole landscape had the particular hushed quality of a place that had agreed for the moment to be quiet. They had dinner and did not talk about the case, which was the right instinct from both of them. Cecily, because she had driven 3 hours and deserved an evening that wasn't entirely shaped by the thing that had shaped too many years already, and Ellie because she was learning slowly the difference between holding something and gripping it. The case was held. It was in the right hands. Gripping it would not make it move faster. They talked about Cecily's work, about the apartment she had finally repainted after 2 years of meaning to, about a friend who had just had a baby and was exhausted and radiant in the specific way that Cecily described with the fond clarity of someone who loved the person very much and was not yet ready to feel whatever she felt about the other parts of that picture. After dinner over tea, Ellie got up and took the tin box from the shelf. She set it on the table between them. Cecily looked at it. She knew what it was. She had grown up with her grandmother's tin box in the house, had watched her mother adopt. It had understood its function without being told. She had not asked about it in 7 years, and Ellie had not offered it, and the box had been in the room between them on her occasional visits like a piece of furniture they had both agreed to navigate around. "I want to show you something," Ellie said. She opened the box and took out the piece of paper she had set aside. "The pieces exist. There are more of them than I knew." She set it on the table, unfolded, facing Cecily. Cecily read it, looked up. "There's something else," Ellie said. She did not take out more papers. Instead, she reached into the drawer of the kitchen table, the shallow one she used for odds and ends, and produced the envelope that Willa Pruitt had given her in the courthouse hallway. She had not yet told anyone about this. She had been carrying it since the day of the hearing in the drawer rather than in her pocket, because she had not been ready to open it. She was ready now. But she did not want to open it alone. She handed it to Cecily. Cecily turned it over, read the name on the front. Bernard in Willa's handwriting, and looked at her mother with a question she didn't form into words. "Willa Pruitt gave it to me," Ellie said. "After the hearing. She said your father had written it to her 8 years ago. She'd been keeping it." Cecily opened the envelope with the care of someone handling something that had been kept a long time. She unfolded the card inside. It was a simple note card, the kind you picked up at a drugstore in a 3-pack with a small printed border of pale blue. Bernard's handwriting was on it, the rounded, unhurried penmanship of a man who wrote like he did everything without rushing. Cecily read it silently. Ellie watched her daughter's face move through something she could not name precisely, and did not try to the particular interior weather of a person receiving something from someone they had lost in a form they had not known was waiting. When Cecily finished, she set the card on the table and pushed it gently toward her mother. Ellie read it. Bernard had written to Willa about Ellie the way he wrote about everything directly, without ornamentation. He had said that Ellie carried things quietly, that she always had, that it was both her great strength and the thing he worried about most, because quiet carrying could look like acceptance from the outside and was not the same thing at all. He had written, "She carries things quietly. When she finally puts them down, make sure someone is there." He had written it 8 years ago, 2 years before he died, in the specific foresight of a man who understood the person he was married to and knew without being told what kind of weight she would still be holding when he was no longer there to hold it with her. Willa had kept the card. She had not given it to Ellie in the courthouse hallway because of Desmond. She had given it because she had spent 8 years waiting for the moment described in it, and that afternoon in the courthouse had been the first time she recognized it. Ellie sat with the card in her hands for a long moment. The small, careful words of a man who had known her completely and had still loved her completely, which was not the same thing as an easy love, and which was the only kind that had ever felt real. She had spent 7 years carrying the weight of what he had left behind, the grief of him, the absence of him, the specific daily ache of a presence so incorporated into the rhythm of a life that its removal changed the sound of everything. She had carried it in the tin box and in the clinic and in the early mornings at the window with bad coffee and in the work, always in the work, which was the thing she trusted most because it kept moving even when she didn't. But she had not known until this moment that he had carried her forward too, that he had seen what was coming, not the specifics, not the case or the autumn or the man on the steps, but the shape of it, the inevitability of a woman like her eventually deciding that quiet was not the same as finished. And he had left something behind for that moment, not for her, for whoever was standing beside her when it came. She folded the card along its crease, put it back in the envelope, set it in the tin box on top of all the papers where it fit with the small natural rightness of something that had always belonged there and had only now arrived. She closed the lid. Cecily was watching her. Her eyes were bright in a way she was managing with the same quiet discipline she had gotten Ellie had always known from her father's side of the family and also from her mother's, which was perhaps why it was so thoroughgoing. "He knew," Cecily said. "He knew." Ellie agreed. They sat in the kitchen with the snow coming down outside, the particular hush of a December evening in the mountains, when the first real snow fell and the world reduced itself to whatever was inside the light you were sitting in. The tea had gone cold. Neither of them moved to remake it. There were things that were more important than warm tea, and this was one of them, and they both knew it, and the knowing of it together was its own kind of warmth. The Federal Review concluded in the spring. Ellie was not present for most of it, which was by design, and by the nature of these processes, they moved through channels she did not have access to, and produced findings she received in the form of letters and phone calls from Warren Delk, who translated the formal language into plain terms, with the practiced patience of someone who understood that official documents were written for other officials, and that translation was a service, not a condescension. The findings were unambiguous. Delk used that word specifically on the phone in early April, unambiguous. The billing fraud had been documented across the relevant period. The federal healthcare fraud violation had been established. The falsification of records had been attributed through the documentary evidence and through Doris Fenwick's formal testimony to instructions originating with Desmond Pruitt acting in his capacity as board chair. Charges were filed. His attorney negotiated. The negotiation produced an outcome that was not nothing and was not everything, and was the specific form of consequence available to a 68-year-old man with 3 decades of county standing and a lawyer who was very good at his work. Ellie's nursing record was formally corrected. The 2018 finding was vacated. The documentation of the process, the referral, the review, the evidentiary record was entered into the county's permanent file in a way that could not be quietly reversed. She received a letter from the Virginia Board of Nursing that was 3 paragraphs long and written in the language of official restitution, which was not the language of an apology, but was the closest thing the system had to one. She read it once, put it in the tin box, not on top of Bernard's card. Beneath it, some things had the right order. On a morning in early May, she arrived at the clinic at 6:15 to find that someone had repainted the sign. Not replaced it. Repainted it the same dimensions, the same simple font, but fresh paint, the kind of green that was still vivid and would fade only slowly. At the base of the signpost, partially obscured by new grass, was a small handwritten note in a Ziploc bag. We thought it was time. No name. She recognized Otis Crane's handwriting because she had seen it on the attendance sheet at 2 months of Friday meetings, but the handwriting was not the whole story. The whole story was the 10 or 12 people it would have taken to plan and execute a sign repainting at 5 in the morning without being noticed, and who those people were and what it meant that they had decided this was the right gesture at the right time. She stood in the morning light with the note in her hand for a long moment. The mountains behind the town were already showing the bright particular green of a Virginia spring, and the maples in the lot were thick with new leaves, and the air had the smell of recent rain and warming earth, the smell of a season that had decided to begin. She tucked the note in her coat pocket, went inside, made coffee. Grady appeared at 6:45, which had become without either of them noting its becoming the usual time. He had a bag from the diner and the particular expression of a man who was aware of the sign and had decided to say nothing about it and let it be what it was. She poured him coffee. They stood at the back window and looked out at the lot where the morning light was doing what morning light did in May, falling at an angle that was almost horizontal, the way light fell when it was still early and the world was still deciding what kind of day it would be. After a while he said, "Cecily coming up this weekend." "Saturday," Ellie said. He nodded, drank his coffee. Outside, a car pulled into the lot. The first patient of the day early the way Earl Combs was always early because he had nowhere else to be, and preferred to be early somewhere than on time at home. She could see him through the window sitting in his car, giving her a few minutes to get ready, the unconscious courtesy of a man who had lived long enough to understand that giving people a few minutes was the most reliable kindness. She watched him and felt the full, ordinary weight of the morning, the coffee, the window, the mountains, the sound of the building settling in the warmth, the man beside her who had come from far away and found in a town where he knew no one, the particular purpose of being useful to someone who needed it and had not known how to ask. She thought about what it had taken to get here. Not the case was its own story with its own beginning and end. She meant the other thing, the longer thing. The 7 years of small pieces of paper in a tin box, the daily act of writing down what she knew to be true, when the world insisted otherwise, the discipline of holding something carefully through all the years it had no place to go. She thought about what her mother had understood with the practical clarity of a woman who had lived a long time without theorizing about it, that the truth did not require a witness to be true. It required only that someone keep it, that someone write it down, fold it small, put it somewhere safe, and have the patience to wait for the moment when the world was finally ready to hold it too. She had done that. For 7 years in the back room of a small clinic in a fold of the Blue Ridge Mountains, she had done that. The tin box was on the shelf. It would stay there. She would add to it and occasionally take from it, and someday she imagined Cecily would inherit it the way she had inherited her mother's. Not knowing what to do with it at first, and then knowing because these things had a way of becoming clear when the need arose. The paper held. That was what it did. Earl Combs got out of his car and she went to unlock the front door, and the morning opened itself in the ordinary way of mornings that do not know they are significant and are significant anyway, in the light, in the smell of the air, in the sound of gravel under a careful step, in the fact of a door that swings open to let someone in. If you've carried something true for a long time, something you knew in your bones even when no one around you would say it aloud, and you've been wondering whether it was worth holding on to, it was. And if there's something you've known to be true for years still folded up somewhere inside you, still waiting for the right moment, what would it mean to finally write it down?